Good morning. The subject of today's panel will be of special interest to many. The foreign policy dynamic for the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran has never seemed to offer Tehran so many challenges and opportunities. Some foreign policy priorities will be familiar, others quite new. Iran must deflect pressures in response to its nuclear, regional, missile, and terrorist activities that continue, because these pressures would complicate its transition to a new generation of hardline leadership. The Raisi government will seek international acknowledgement of its nuclear advances and the lifting of US-led sanctions. Tehran will also seek to sustain its regional influence, to weaken Western influence and threaten Israel, while at the same time maintaining the position of its costly proxies who have burrowed deep into the political architecture of their respective host countries. Iran also faces a rapid technological and social transformation in the region that leaves it increasingly behind with an archaic ideology and an ineffective economic strategy. Iran's population appears increasingly disconnected from regime ideology. But if these demands are great, today's world also provides Iran with new opportunities. Collective security is in question. The international community routinely overlooks Iran's aggression, to include actions that in past many would have thought would have led to a military conflict. America's relations with Russia and China are low, making international unity unlikely. The US is no longer in Afghanistan. Washington seeks to limit its involvement in regional conflict, but yet still claims to remain committed to the defense of regional partners. How will Iran manage this new dynamic of opportunities and challenges? Should we expect its foreign policy to be characterized by continuity or dramatic change? Today, we are fortunate to have three exceptional voices and personal friends to unpack this complicated issue. Their biographies are deep, impressive, but for brevity's sake, I'm only going to touch on a few points. Alex VATANKA works at Washington's Middle East Institute, where he specializes in Middle Eastern regional and security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. An accomplished author, analyst, his most recent book is the widely acclaimed The Battle for the Ayatollahs, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalries Since 1979, a riveting book. RADOSLAW SIKORSKI is a member of the European Parliament, and from 2007 to 2014 served as the Foreign Minister of Poland, considered one of the foremost foreign policy voices in Europe and of our time. His commentary is routinely praised for its candor and insight. He also brings added insights from his own travel to Iran and engagement with senior officials. And since I'm pointing out books, I should also mention that his magnificent wife, Anne Applebaum, has produced the extraordinary Twilight of Democracies, as well as a fascinating cookbook on Polish culture. Mark Dubowitz, the CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, will also be with us. A routine and respected commentator on Iran's nuclear and non-nuclear activities, he is frequently sought by policymakers on both sides of the aisle and the media for his insights on China, Turkey, and Russia. Alex, let's begin with you. Could you set the stage for us? What will be Iran's definition of a successful foreign policy during the next 2 years? Will this be continuity or change? Is there any reason to expect Iran to compromise on its past ambitions?
Well, first, Norman, thank you very much. It's great to be with you and very much looking forward to the panel and being with Radek and Mark, and thanks to UANI for inviting me. To your question about policy continuity, look, I mean, let's start off with the new Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi. It's been in power now for 3 months. And I want to go back to the word I used here, power, because I think that's the key here. Does he actually have power? Well, he's been there now for 3 months in the presidential palace. And I can make the argument he's been the weakest president since the Islamic Republic was founded back in 1979. The man doesn't have a popular mandate. I mean, the election was basically given to him on a silver platter. The system, the regime, if you will, made sure nobody else could be in his way. Ayatollah Khamenei, the unelected supreme leader, made sure Raisi became the president, and the Revolutionary Guards, the other very important actor in this Iranian system, made sure nobody was going to question Khamenei's wisdom about why Raisi should become president. So, Norman, to your point about continuity, Raisi is not going to shake anything up. Raisi doesn't have a vision. He doesn't stand for anything. He is beholden to two entities, the office of the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards. And so whatever they did before, you can expect that to continue under Raisi. I don't think Raisi at any point is going to bring about any change because he doesn't have the political power or, as I said before, vision. So yeah, I mean, I suspect what you can expect is continuity because the same players who've been running Iran's two most important sensitive files, the nuclear file and Iran's regional file. Those two centers of power, they have not had a shift in personnel. The same individuals who've been running the show are still there. And the question then becomes, how do you shape their calculations? And I wish I could sit here and tell you that Ayatollah Khamenei, being 82 years old as a supreme leader, that he would take a page out of the book of his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, who before he died was convinced by his advisors that, look, before you die, you should end the Iran-Iraq war. Because after you die, nobody can really do it as well as you could. So end this war, and he did. So Khomeini ended the Iran-Iraq war just before he died. Khamenei has an opportunity to take a different direction vis-a-vis the United States, the world, and sort of bring Iran back into something that looks like international mainstream. But there is no sign that that's what Khamenei wants to do, which makes me as pessimistic as I am. I hate to do it, but that's how I see it.
Thank you. Radek, if we may turn to you, please. Since 1979, Europe has consistently maintained what many in the US and elsewhere see as an unrelenting soft approach to Iran, supporting economic sanctions with little enthusiasm, opposing non-economic coercive measures across the board, and leaving the hard work or the tough job to Washington. Is this characterization fair? How will Europe respond to this same international dynamic that Iran confronts and Iran's likely behavior is laid out by Alex?
To beef up my credentials, I should mention that I signed the missile defense agreement with Condoleezza Rice, and the base is being finished. And the primary justification for it, as you know, was to protect the United States, but also Europe. It's an Aegis onshore system from missiles coming from Iran. And I'm saying this because this underlines that Europe is actually closer to Iran than the United States, and nuclear-tipped missiles would become a threat to us much earlier. So you would expect Europe to be tougher on Iran. But I think you're right that Europe is ambivalent, but I would call this the strategy of the good cop. You know, sometimes to get the results, you need different approaches. The European Parliament tends to be tough. We've just had another resolution, and on issues to do with human rights, with political prisoners, we are tough and we sometimes succeed. We've just had a Mr. Sayed Sangha released from prison in Tehran. But the European Union is really run by its permanent bureaucracy, the European Commission, and the European Council, which is to say the prime ministers of the member states. And there, what is striking is that the various conclusions that as we call them, which are sort of orders, treat Iran in a traditional Westphalian manner as another nation state. The ideological component is completely missing. And as we know, that's the core issue. And so Europe has been sending its high representative to Tehran, was of course regarded the JCPOA as a success of its diplomacy, and is trying to use all kinds of instruments. Very little trade, in fact, about 3 billion. So that's not an issue for us. We are a 15 trillion euro economy. It's trying to be helpful to the United States by maintaining channels of communications open, and I think that might yet become useful one day.
Thank you. And thank you for your support for the missile defense work. That was deemed as critical at the time. And I recall the conversations, and your role, your personal role in that was quite important. Mark, time for your wisdom. Since 1979, every American administration has attempted to engage or confront Iran, sometimes simultaneously. Western leaders appear in full agreement on the nature of the Iran challenge. There are no denials as to the litany of Iranian misbehavior, aggressions, and crimes. But the last three administrations in the United States have shifted dramatically between engagement and confrontation. A bipartisan foreign policy in Iran no longer exists, and indeed it's difficult to say what defines U.S. policy on Iran outside of a return to the Iran nuclear deal.
Mhm.
Is this view correct? Is it possible to restore bipartisanship to Iran foreign policy? What's the U.S. path forward in the world that Radek and Alex have described?
Norm, first of all, thank you very much. Thanks to UANI for certainly all its phenomenal work on Iran over the years. Norm, thank you for your service to our country and particularly on this issue, and a real pleasure to be with such great experts whose work I so admire. So you're right. I mean, we've had policies since 1979 of, on one hand, seduction, and on the other hand, coercion. There's certainly been administrations who believe you can seduce the hard men of Iran to become more practical and responsible global stakeholders. And you do that by flooding them with cash. You integrate them into the global economy, you get them engaged in trade, and you strengthen the so-called moderates against the hardliners, or at least that's been the view of some administrations. On the other side, administrations believe you use coercive instruments of power, American power, in order to build leverage, in order to get Iran back to the table to negotiate on its nuclear agreement and try to roll back or at least constrain its regional aggression. And that's certainly been a mark of some administrations. And some administrations, I think, as you pointed out, practice both seduction and coercion, sometimes simultaneously, or to Radek's point of view, the Europeans seduce, the Americans coerce, and the Israelis really coerce. And that's certainly been a hallmark of some administrations. I think where we are today is at a point where this administration, the Biden administration, believed in 8 months of seduction. They believed they could seduce the previous Iranian administration and the new one to come back to the table, to go back into the JCPOA or to do some kind of limited nuclear deal to at least temporarily constrain Iran's nuclear program. I think that this administration is now waking up to the reality that seduction is not going to work against Raisi and against Khamenei, and they're going to need some element of coercion. And this is the so-called Plan B that is currently under discussion between the United States and Israel. Now, the United States continues to play good cop. The Israelis are playing bad cop. And I think there's much closer coordination, at least under this administration, than in the past, which is a good thing. But I think we're still suffering in the United States under a certain delusion, and that is that we can reach an arms control agreement with the mullahs. We could then put that nuclear program, quote unquote, in a box, in the words of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And then we can go on to negotiate a longer and stronger agreement with Iran that actually permanently cuts off all pathways to nuclear weapons. That's a good sign in terms of bipartisan agreement that the JCPOA was flawed and limited, and that a new agreement is reached and reachable. Unfortunately, I think it's also a bad sign in the sense that once that agreement goes back into the back burner, or once the nuclear program, quote unquote, is in a temporary box, it goes off the US priority list, and that any temporary deal becomes a permanent deal. And that's the deal we live with, while the regime takes patient pathways to nuclear weapons, builds up its economy against the peaceful use of future sanctions, and continues its regional aggression. I think the one area where Democrats and Republicans are certainly united, where Americans and Europeans are united, is on the area of human rights. I think everybody acknowledged that this is a brutally repressive regime, and that we are seeing, at least in Congress, Democrats and Republicans coming together on this issue. But the nuclear issue continues to divide Washington, polarize the policy community, and dominate the foreign policy agenda.
Thank you. Fascinating. Gentlemen, I'd like to pose a question to all three of you. So you all have extensive experience in the region. Mark has just concluded an important trip to the Gulf. I'd like to take the question of what compromises could Iran make to the region to improve its relationship and that might achieve its goals of hegemony. And if these compromises aren't made, what actually changes in the region? I'd like to tie that also to what does Plan B mean for the region? And finally, if you would comment on if JCPOA is indeed brought back to life, it protects Iran's from three sanctions pressures: oil exports, repatriation of revenues from all exports, and use of international financial systems. If those are protected in a nuclear deal, what coercive elements actually exist beyond military to compel Iran to cease provision of missiles to the Houthis, its activities in Syria, which get no publicity but yet continue, and other malign behavior? Alex, what do you think?
Sure. So Norman, I think, to the last point you made, I agree. If you do have, let's say for the sake of argument, that these nuclear talks that are due to resume on the 29th of November, that they result in another nuclear agreement of sorts, the way we had it in 2015. And to be honest, that right now, given how the Iranian nuclear program has expanded rapidly in the last couple of years, that might not be a bad thing at all. That might be something that you can be hopeful about, that you can build on. But the question then is, I think the ball would be in the court of the Iranians. Would they be willing to expand the conversation to talk about all these other issues that are always going to be in the room, can be ignored, and need to be tackled for any nuclear agreement to survive? We all know what happened in 2015. After the deal was signed, Iran didn't change in terms of its policies in the region. And I know the Iranians have their own grievances. They'll say the American position didn't change either. So it wasn't just our fault. My point is, if this is going to go anywhere this second time around, you need political confidence. You need to broaden the conversation. You can't limit it just to the nuclear issue. I think the Iranians know this. They need to accept, the fact that they, don't want to sit down and meet face to face with American diplomats and officials. It just shows you, I think, the lack of seriousness on their part. And again, it's a separate issue. We can debate why they have anxieties about reaching a new deal, because they feel that ultimately, the United States is after regime change. It doesn't matter if you reach a new deal with the U.S. or not. But I want to go back to a point that I think is critical. Being an Iran watcher, spending most of my time looking at the debate in Tehran, I don't see any signs of Ayatollah Khamenei and the senior leadership, who are getting old and they soon will leave, preparing the ground for the next generation to having an idea that is convincing in terms of a blueprint about what next in terms of relations with the United States. What they do know, and I freely admit to, is not having relations with the United States has cost Iran dearly. In fact, let me just give you one statistic. They've lost about, based on their own figures, 57% of their GDP in 3 years. Iran is bleeding. So yes, even if there's a new agreement, Norman, to your point, they might be able to export whatever it is they're selling to China, double that and get the money back in. But that would, at very best, be helping Iran to survive, but not to thrive. And what we are seeing in terms of the realities on the ground in Iranian society, this is a population of 85 million people who've had enough of simply surviving. They aspire to something much bigger. They know their country can do a heck of a lot more than it's doing today. And I think that's momentum coming from the streets up. You can crack down on it, you can repress it so many times. Eventually, I think the regime is taking a big risk here, thinking that it can just continue the path that it's been on. It's a very risky path. For the sake of the survival of the Islamic Republic, I do wonder why Khamenei doesn't want to, make some concessions before it's too late. And final point I make, and I don't know if you're going to get into it, if there is a plan B, is that Russia and China somehow miraculously going to come in and save Iran from itself. That's a pipe dream. They might save Iran at the IEA in Vienna or the UN Security Council meetings, but they're not going to be able to do what the Iranian economy needs to do, which is to become a normal economy, to deliver basic services for its own people. And that's the critical challenge for the Islamic Republic.
Thank you. And I plan to hit Russia and China as my next question. Radek, what do you think? Will Iran make any real concessions to the region, change its regional strategy? What happens if JCPOA is restored or not restored to that dynamic?
Well, Iran as an ancient nation state, of course, has some legitimate interests, including security interests. But at the same time, it's the last of the 3 20th century utopias. It's a theocracy, and there's no going around it. What threatens us is the nature of the regime. And I don't believe they are capable of abandoning their ideology and abandoning their internal logic. And this is a very hardline team that we have in charge now. When people talk about playing off the moderates against hardliners, I'm always reminded of the obituary of Joseph Stalin that appeared in the 1950s in the Times of London, which I paraphrase. Comrade Stalin was not an angel, but a good ally, and now the hardliners might take over.
Indeed. Thank you. Mark, your wisdom, sir.
Oh, actually, it's a great segue to what I was going to say, which is I think we can learn a lot about the Soviet Union and the Reagan strategy against the Soviet Union. And I think we need to move in Washington beyond this obsession over arms control and the nuclear agreement, and to a more comprehensive strategy, which recognizes that the Islamic Republic, like the Soviet Union, is ideologically bankrupt, economically bankrupt, despised by the majority of its people, and intrinsically aggressive, and is not going to change or reform or moderate in any way. I mean, we may be at this sort of Brezhnev moment right now, where you have this decrepit regime with an aged dictator who's soon to be, going to be ending his time on Earth, and is obsessed with preserving whatever's left of a system that's broken. I think we should take advantage of that moment. I think we should be much more focused on supporting the 85 million Iranians that Alex was talking about, many of whom despise this regime, who've gone out and protested against this regime, increasingly on the streets, have paid an enormous price for it, have gotten very little support from the United States. And our only policy over successive administrations, dating back to the Carter administration, as I recall, is we use sanctions against Iran. We use economic power. We're unwilling to use other instruments of American power. We sort of outsource other instruments of power to the Israelis, and the Israelis are quite competent. But again, it's a country of 10 million people with a tiny air force, a small intelligence community. They've run circles around the regime in Iran, which should be an indication to us that the regime is not 10 feet tall, and that the United States, if we were to apply pressure and other instruments of American power, and we were to support the Iranian people, we could end up in the same result that we did during the Cold War, where Ronald Reagan fundamentally readjusted and reorganized the US security bureaucracy to go after the Soviet Union, and made it very clear that we don't back regime change, but it's inevitable that the Soviet Union would end up in the ash heap of history, as Ronald Reagan said in his famous Westminster speech. I would love to see a US president give an equivalent of the Westminster speech as directed against the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's inevitable that the Islamic Republic will end up in the ash heap of history. And then we should come forth with a strategy like Reagan did in 1983 with National Security Decision Directive 75, where we have an Iran equivalent to use all instruments of American power to constrain, to contain, to combat the Islamic Republic, and ultimately to support the Iranian people and their aspirations to bring down this regime.
Thank you. You've spoken on this issue in the past, and your words have been very well received in a number of parts of Washington. So thank you for raising those points. Gentlemen, China. In 2016, after the nuclear deal was concluded, the Chinese president made a trip to first Saudi Arabia and then Iran. He concluded the beginning of an economic agreement that was later announced as a ginormous proposal that seemed to touch every part of Iran's economy and inevitably its political dimensions as well. What is China to Iran? What is the framework of that relationship, and what are the limits on that relationship? Radek, perhaps we can start with you.
Well, first of all, there is the delicious irony that a theocracy is collaborating with a godless communist state. But as we know, there are historical parallels to such deals across ideological divides. Look, the hotter the rivalry between China and the United States out in the Far East, the closer Iran will feel to China, and the closer they will collaborate. Iran just doesn't have a choice, right? I understand that some of these framework agreements have not actually been executed in the sense of actual loans to build actual infrastructure. As we know, some of them are problematic, as Sri Lanka and Montenegro and some African states have learned. If you don't pay up, China takes over your vital infrastructure. So I read this as a sign of Iran's desperation.
Thank you. Alex.
Norman, when I was school child, early 80s in Tehran, one of the slogans we had to chant every morning before we were allowed to walk into our classroom was neither west nor east, we're going to go a separate way. I'm translating from Persian to English, but basically the promise of the revolution of 79 was the Islamic Republic will stand on its own 2 feet. We don't need to, siding with any global bloc. God, where are we today? I mean, look at Iran's desperate attempt to, project China as this extremely intimate economic power. You talked about the so-called $400 billion strategic deal. The 400 billion, from what I understand, increasingly is just a made up number. It's a staggering amount of money if that was true, but it's very likely to not be the case. We do know the Chinese have become the largest trading partner of every single state in the Middle East over the last 2 decades or so, replacing countries like Germany that have lost over the years in that part of the world in terms of market share. So China does look at Iran as a one among many Middle Eastern markets. Will China go to war to defend the Islamic Republic? I don't see anything like that. China is obviously playing its part right now by putting pressure on the US in the framework of the nuclear agreement. It's more of a reflection of Chinese-Russian attempt to sort of bring the US down on the global stage on a key issue, as opposed to representing a particular Chinese vision to stand for the Islamic all the way. I don't think China intends to do that. I don't think the Russians intend to do that. In a sense, what I think Russia and China are doing, using, and this is no news to anyone, using the Iran card for their own purposes, while the Iranian national interests are being sacrificed. I make one final point, Norman. Look, we're talking about China. I mean, one of the big things that's been mentioned in recent years, the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran was supposed to be a heart of it, received billions of dollars in Chinese investment. Number one, it never happened. So far, it hasn't happened. And imagine in Iran that actually had a pretty balanced foreign policy, that it could, because China's economic rise is a reality. You can't deny it. And it would be foolish for anyone to assume that Iran and China shouldn't be economic partners. There's a lot in terms of natural trade that can happen. So that's a reality. But Iran could have even a stronger hand by having a better foreign policy that doesn't see Iran sanctioned, because in Iran that is sanctioned because it doesn't, sit down and go through the tough issues with the likes of Washington. When that happens, Iran becomes weaker, and a weaker Iran, easier for the Chinese to manipulate for their own purposes. And the Russians have done that beautifully for the last two decades. So Iranian national interests again and again are being sacrificed for the narrow interest of one faction that dominates in Tehran, that puts its own survival above the Iranian national interest. And I said final point, but this is the final point. Norman, today is the 4th of November. 42 years ago, the supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini overran the US embassy in Tehran for factional political interest. And look what they did to the country's foreign policy for the last 4 decades. I do pity the Iranian people that have to live with the consequences of frankly, terrible decisions made at the top in Tehran.
Thank you.
Just with reference to what you said at the beginning, that Iran has an ambition to be neither with the West nor with the East. In the 1990s, when we in Poland were recovering from communism, we had a saying, the third way leads to the third world.
Good one.
Good quote. Mark.
Yeah, Norm, I'll just make a very simple point when it comes to the relationship between China and Iran, is that when the US president is willing to threaten secondary sanctions against Chinese banks stop doing business with Iran. I mean, it's as simple as that. It happened under the Obama administration. It happened under the Trump administration. You saw a significant drop in Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, A, because they had alternatives and the Saudis and others were stepping up, and B, because the Chinese banks that were processing those oil transactions, at the end of the day, most of them want to be global financial institutions. They need access to the global financial system. They need to be working in the US dollar or in currencies that are convertible through the US dollar. And when we are serious, and when OFAC is serious about enforcing those sanctions, the Chinese banks play ball. Now, for how long that will happen, it's a big question for how long the US dollar will dominate, for how long the United States economy will be the pillar of the global economy. But for now, or for sure, in the near future, we have tremendous coercive power over Chinese financial institutions, and we should use that. Instead, we're going exactly the opposite way, which is why, as UANI has done a great job of tracking, Chinese purchases of Iranian oil have skyrocketed since the Biden administration's policy of seduction has taken over and maximum pressure has been jettisoned.
I agree, and I also want to double tap the UANI's work on oil purchases and ship tracking. It's a wonderful resource. It's detailed, fact-based, timely, almost actionable. It's just, I mean, it's literally something you can work with on a daily basis. So honor due to all those involved. So we've had a number of questions pull in, and I'd like to shift to those, and I may combine a few to save time. The issue of Afghanistan, the American pullout, what this means for Iran looking east, Iran with the Central Asian states, Iran's new relationship with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Russia and China, Iran's relations with Turkey over Azerbaijan and Armenia issues. What has happened in recent months to Iran's plans for its east near abroad and its relationships with Turkey and the Central Asian states? Mark, why don't we begin with you?
Well, Norm, it's a lot to unpack. Look, I think the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, sent a clear message. I certainly, in the region, I was just there. And every interlocutor that you sat down with, I was deeply concerned that this is an indication the United States does not have the resolve, does not have the commitment to the region. And we're speaking about China. I mean, as the US sort of pivots out of the Middle East, the Chinese are pivoting in. And every country in the Middle East, including many of our closest allies, are hedging. And they're hedging their bets, and they understand that the new superpower in town is from Beijing, and they're going to have to play ball with Beijing. So we've had the Afghanistan pullout seriously damaged U.S. credibility. Now, can we take advantage of that? I think we can. I don't think Iran's strategic position in the region is that strong. I think the Iranians are facing on every border and throughout the whole region significant pushback against their revolutionary expansionism. You mentioned as Azerbaijan. I find the Azerbaijan-Iran issue really fascinating. It obviously brings up lots of sensitive ethnic issues, but it's clear that it's very sensitive to the regime in Iran. They are deeply concerned about what's happening in Azerbaijan, the messaging from Azerbaijan, and the fact that Azerbaijan represents a moderate, secular Shiite nation that has been prosperous and successful and peaceful and stable. And that is an example that the mullahs in Tehran really fear, because the majority of Iranian people who have the opportunity to go to Baku to see Azerbaijan or go to Dubai, for example, see very successful Muslim societies that are able to deliver the goods for their people, and this stands in marked contrast to the bankruptcy of the regime.
Thank you, Alex.
I mean, 2 points. One specifically on Afghanistan. Initially, when the U.S. pulled out, there was an element of surprise in Tehran, no doubt, as was the case in the rest of the world, including here in the United States, the way it was done. And frankly, it was done very poorly. And then there was, for a couple of days, the Iranian state-run media were trying to score cheap points here, that, this is a reflection of the defeat of the American agenda for the broader Middle East. And that was to be anticipated, that sort of a language. And then it hit them. My God, we could be the biggest losers of the Americans pulling out of Afghanistan the way they just did. Afghanistan on the US, presence had become a trading partner of Iran. It was an important market for Iran. And the American presence and the fact that it was a central government in Kabul had turned around and created a degree of stability, and it might come as a surprise to people, but it did create a degree of stability. And for example, the situation now is such that if the Afghan economy collapses, if there is a return to the civil war, the Iranians can anticipate huge numbers of Afghan refugees arrive the way they have done in the past when there's conflict in that country. And the sanction impoverished Iran today is in such a terrible situation that it won't be able to deal with him, and it creates a crisis. In other words, put simply, Norman, the US pulling out of Afghanistan, you could say Iran has been a big loser so far, and it should be concerned about what it means. Broadly speaking, on the topic of the region, this is the problem. The Islamic Republic has, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, put the ideological interest above the national interest. When Iran invests energy in South Lebanon or in Syria or in Yemen, it wasn't keeping an eye on what was going on in the South Caucasus, a country that is adjacent to Iran. As Mark pointed out, there are 20 million plus Iranian ethnic Azeris. What happens in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan has a direct bearing on Iranian national interest. And yet the Iranians were taken by surprise. Why? Because they have invested elsewhere. They have sacrificed, in my view, what investments that should be focused on closer to home issues, like what's going on in Afghanistan, in the South Caucasus, on faraway lands like Yemen that really have no strategic significance for the national security of the country of Iran, but matter for Iran's ideological vision of few individuals in Tehran like Ayatollah Khamenei. So I think that's a real case of grievance among Iranian people, how the foreign policy, instead of empowering the country, has instead resulted in the opposite, weakening its stance in the region.
Thank you. Radek, please.
Let's remember that in the 1980s, Iran was in fact our ally against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen groups could regroup in Iran. Refugees from Afghanistan were able to settle there, and some of them are still there. And then again, in the 90s, the Taliban are a radical Sunni group, and there were even some murders of Iranian diplomats and persecution of the Hazara Shia minority in Afghanistan, and there were some contacts and some collaboration against the Taliban. The US has now not only gone to zero, which I also believe is a mistake, but has closed down its embassy, which it didn't have to do. And this is seen as a signal that we're done, your problem now. And the question is, whose problem? And I think this is now going to be managed by China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. I think Iran will have a seat at the table, which I'm afraid will broaden its options.
Thank you. We have many questions pouring in, and I'm going to continue to try and combine them. I'd like to take this into a different direction. In recent days in the United States, we've just seen a number of elections that have grabbed a lot of political interest. We've seen the COP26 conference in Glasgow. We see a great emphasis on human rights. But if you look at Iran, you come up with three vexing issues that the world seems to ignore. Iran has persecuted and indeed killed members of its animal rights program. Its LGBTQ record is among the worst on the planet. Its efforts regarding its environmental issues over the years, irrelevant from sanctions, as we've seen with bodies of water in Iran, are terrible. Why does Iran get a pass on killing animal rights activists, persecuting its own citizens, and destroying its economy? Alex.
Norman, I'm not sure if it gets a pass. I mean, obviously you're aware that it's going on, but you're right in the sense that, we have to, there's so much that's wrong in terms of the actions of the Islamic Republic. You have to choose what matters the most. And clearly, certainly for the US in recent years, the nuclear issue has been the most important. So you focus on what you care about the most, doesn't mean you ignore or are unaware of all the other things that are wrong. Because I love to hear all the questions and I won't be too long-winded about it, but I think the issue here is the following. There is a massive amount of space between the ruling elite in Tehran and the population in that country. There's a very dynamic Iranian civil society that knows what's wrong. And people often forget, and I always remind people, don't give up on the Iranian civil society. The sentiments of the Iranian people. This is a rich country, a recorded history of over 5,000 years. Had a constitutional revolution, for God's sake, in 1906, where they forced the king to give him a parliament and a constitution. This is a happening civil society. They are angry. They feel that they're being left out. The rest of the world is cruising ahead, and yet they can't even sell crude oil to markets at a time where everybody else is trying to drop crude oil and move on to the next best technology out there. That frustration is real. And as somebody like myself who spent 10 hours a day following what's going on in Iran, I just do know that it exists. How it's going to sort of come about in terms of political anger and become a liability for the regime, that's the part I don't know. Because the one thing that the regime has had and continues to have is two things: access to arms and repressive tools, and a willingness to use it. So far, that has kept them in power. How long more that can go on for, I have no idea.
Thank you. Radek, I'd like to take that question and just tweak it just a little bit for you. Does the European Union represent the views of the citizens of its many countries? What would the average Pole or Norwegian say about the issues I've raised and how foreign policy regarding Iran should be crafted? And is that appropriately reflected by the European Union? And I'm taking this from a question that has come in from one of our kind viewers.
Oh, I think there is widespread understanding that Iran is an inhuman regime. Even at the level, when I supervised our consular service, I dealt with our LGBT community to put in the Polish consular directives a warning to people that in Iran there is a death penalty for homosexual acts, so as to warn people. I don't think they get a pass. North Korea still has concentration camps. We know about it. It's just that there is nothing we can do about it. There's a helplessness rather than giving them a pass. But it's at the same time not exactly a totalitarian society. In North Korea, where I've also been, you have the impression of constant fear among the locals. Not so in Iran. Let me give you an anecdote. When I went for my talks with Minister Zarif, I complained to him that, look, from my hotel, I tried to log on to the webpage of Poland's newspaper of record, and I got this message from the religious police that this is a forbidden site. And I thought I would embarrass him. And he and everybody on his side of the tables laughed and said, yeah, these are mullahs. Our young people, thanks to that, have learned how to use VPNs. Which suggests to me that people do have access to information. So one condition of a totalitarian society is not fulfilled despite the regime's best efforts.
Indeed. Thank you. Mark, I'd like to tweak this just a little bit. We're looking at elections in 2022. We have a loud and influential left in the United States, more so than any time in our recent political history. Could you take the same question, animal rights, human rights, environmental rights, and why doesn't this resound with the American left, which is so proud of its protection of these issues in the United States and elsewhere in shaping foreign policy? And do you see that changing?
Yeah, profound question. I think because the far left in America hates Israel and Saudi Arabia far more than they hate the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's just a fact, it's incomprehensible. I don't know why. They may even acknowledge that there are some human rights problems in Tehran, but they automatically shift it to, well, what about Riyadh? Well, what about Jerusalem? Well, what about the UAE? It sort of becomes a whataboutism discussion. I think that the fact is that it plays into the sort of left-wing narrative that that Iran is a proud civilization, and at the end of the day there are some hardliners there who've created problems. But people like Mr. Zarif, for example, Radek mentioned him. If only we could get more Zarifs to have more power in Tehran, then Tehran would become Iran would become a more open and civilized place. And indeed, it's the American right that is emboldening the hardliners inside Iran and preventing men like Mr. Zarif and Mr. Rouhani from attaining power and integrating Iran into the global economy. In other words, we're trying to seduce the hardliners, and that we are ignoring the moderates. And that whole moderate hardliner dichotomy, which was so emblematic of the debate in Washington since really 2013, and since Rouhani came into power, I think what it did was it created a perception that the problems inside Iran, the repression, the brutality, are a response to American coercion and American hardliners who refused to understand that there are real moderates. I mean, you mentioned Zarif. I mean, Zarif is one of the most talented yet mendacious diplomats that probably ever served in any foreign service of any government in modern history. And he had this unique ability, right, to laugh and to smile and joke around and say, you know, at the end of the day, look, it's not me, it's not Rouhani, you know, it's the IRGC and Khamenei, but those guys will hang us from lampposts unless you guys compromise on major elements of our nuclear program, or at least until you stop these, you know, terroristic economic sanctions. He was brilliant at playing the good cop, bad cop, and he played into the far left's view in Washington that at the end of the day, this was a misunderstood regime responding to American imperialism and American aggression, and that as a result, they get an absolute free pass on all of their brutal repression.
I think that's great. Now, I'll just take a moderator's comment to say that I have some background on Iran issues and Middle Eastern issues, and Javad Zarif stands out in my experience as the most mendacious official since Baghdad Bob. But enough of my personal commentary. And I just want to double thump also, the LGBTQ issue in Iran can't get enough attention. We have programs in the United States that have highlighted this in a number of human rights organizations. The Paycon car issue, taken a lot of press recently, has also been out there, and I think this deserves a lot more foreign policy focus, but I'll apologize for my opinions. Back to questions from our kind viewers. Shifting this in a different direction. Al-Qaeda. Iran detained the Al-Qaeda Shura Council. They let many of them go. Al-Qaeda, according to the annual threat assessments published by the ODNI annually, states that there is an operational Al-Qaeda cell known to the Iranian government that is tolerated by the Iranian government in Iran. Iran remains the only country on the planet that I can think of that has such a relationship and has not been a target in the war on terror as a result. I'd like to hear your comments on this issue, since Europe and the United States have not only suffered from Al-Qaeda, but its offshoots in ISIS. And now we have the prospect of Al-Qaeda reconstituting an operational capability in Afghanistan, which may be small, but could be quite potent. And we would have a difficulty identifying this due to our lack of presence and our lack of intelligence. Mark, what do you think?
Well, Norm, it's interesting. I mean, you know, you talk about conventional wisdom in DC, and the conventional wisdom in DC was Al-Qaeda and Iran would never work together because one is Shiites and one is Sunnis. So we know Sunnis and Shiites never work together. Of course, this was nonsense. The 9/11 report talked about Iranian-backed Hezbollah's support for Al-Qaeda and its training. The Obama Treasury Department actually designated Iranian entities and individuals for providing a core facilitation pipeline to Al-Qaeda, quote, a core facilitation pipeline in the words of the Obama administration. And the CIA declassified reams of documents showing the close cooperation between Iran and Al-Qaeda. So, you know, this notion that somehow Iran and Al-Qaeda would never work together was proven to be bunk. And even beyond that, I mean, you know, the Iranians have been so successful in convincing some US officials that they can be partners in counterterrorism efforts. You know, the notion that somehow Iran can help us against ISIS, when the reality was, you know, Iran was the very reason that ISIS arose. I mean, they were the arsonists who would go into these Sunni areas in Iraq and Syria and brutalize Sunnis, you know, just kill and maim and rape and torture. And then ISIS would ride into town and say, listen, we're the only ones who can protect you from Iran and its proxies. And as a result, ISIS got that much more power and expanded geographically in Iraq and Syria. So, and then Iran, as the arsonist, would ride into town and say to us in Washington and in Europe, don't worry, I can also be the firefighter. We can help you against ISIS. So the arsonist became the firefighter. So the Iranians have been very successful at using both ISIS and Al-Qaeda against the United States, both operationally to inflict harm on us, but also in terms of their diplomacy and their efforts at seduction to convince us that they also can be partners in counterterrorism. And of course, that's bunk as well. Thank you.
Alex.
Norman, if I may just make two quick points, and then I'll turn to this issue. Look, I think that where the American left is, the progressives, I think that is something that's missing. When you look at where they stand on Iran policy, and I understand and sympathy why everybody wants a nuclear deal as soon as possible. if it is, within reach. But there's unfortunately not much being said from that side of American politics in terms of what else do they need to do from a moral point of view in terms of, helping people in Iran from the various communities that are being discriminated against. I mean, they're being overlooked, and I think that's definitely something that one can't ignore. In terms of the issue of hardliners and moderates, I know there are folks in DC who don't think there are moderates in the Islamic Republic, but I, as an analyst, have always been able to distinguish among factions, and I would put some of them as moderates and hardliners, but that's yesterday's news. The reality is, if there were ever moderates, they no longer really matter, at least not right now. And I give you one example. 102-year-old Ayatollah Gol Paigani last week made a pretty, innocent comment. He said, we have too many enemies in terms of foreign countries. We should go out there, be friends with everyone. I thought that was pretty innocent. A 102-year-old, I believe he's the most learned, properly learned, not someone who got his title because of political connections. He actually is religiously qualified to call himself a grand Ayatollah. And he says, let's make friends. What does he get from the far right in the Islamic Republic? The ones who supported Raisi? Personal attacks, unheard of. This is how, unfortunately, things have evolved in the Islamic Republic, that, the far right, they are so hell-bent on their ways, and they think they got all the answers, that they are now literally attacking grand ayatollahs, which was unheard of just a few years ago. That's a space to watch. That's a really concerning area. On Al-Qaeda, look, I think Mark put his finger on it. I agree with him, certainly in the case of what has happened since the Arab Spring unfolded. In the case of Syria, we know for a fact that the opposition to the Assad regime that then, in many cases mushroomed to becoming what we called later on as ISIS, might not have emerged the way it did had Iran and others like Russia come to the aid of Mr. President Assad the way they did. So in that sense, they were part of the problem. By repressing the Sunni majority in Syria, they enabled a very bad actor like ISIS to be able to find ground in that country. So yes, I agree with that. Iran has been part of the problem. Although I have to say, on Al-Qaeda specifically, as an open source analyst, there isn't much for me to suggest there's anything that looks like a strategic partnership. At best, and I quote Asaf Mogattem from Herzliya Center in Israel, who's done wonderful work on this. It's tactical cooperation. How far can they push it? Depends on where Iran wants to go. If Iran chooses that its national security interest doesn't matter, all it cares about is hitting the United States, so why wouldn't they work with Al-Qaeda or anybody else for that matter? That's a decision they have to make in terms of overall where they like to go as a country and as a regime. And if they choose anti-Americanism above everything else, then why not work with Al-Qaeda?
I think it's wise comments. And regarding the story that Iran would not cooperate with Sunnis, I think those in Hamas and the Palestine Islamic Jihad may have an alternative view on that theory as well, particularly as they so publicly go to Tehran and thank Tehran for money, weapons, and training. Right. Radek, what is your view? Iran's support for Al-Qaeda or role with Al-Qaeda and how Europe views this?
Let me just refer for a second to Mr. Zarif. Inspired by Tom Kaplan, I named him in the European Parliament as Smiling Ribbentrop, which I think nicely captures the nature of the man. And one has to always bear in mind what kind of regime he and his like represent. Because it's very easy to be captured by the personability, but it's a technique. On Al-Qaeda, I will read to you from the most recent statement by the European Council, which concerns me. Quote, "The Council is deeply concerned by the hostile activities that Iran has conducted on the territory of several member states, and in this context, decided to list 2 individuals and 1 entity." You see the problem with this statement. We are going to impose sanctions, but we are not going to name it as terrorism. That doesn't seem right to me. I think Iranians understand when we use plain language, and of course, Iran is is a state sponsor of terrorism. I don't have any privileged knowledge about what it's planning or which particular attacks it is responsible for, but the history is long and persuasive.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our session, and I've received dozens of questions from what looks like a very large audience, which is honor due to you gentlemen for your appearance. We won't be able to get to all of them, but my hope is that in this final wide-ranging question that you will each be able to touch on some of these issues. What haven't we talked about? What are the black swans that we should expect that will challenge or empower Iranian foreign policy? What opportunities does the West have in containing Iran and perhaps engaging it to take it to a better position in a realistic way? A lot to ask, but maybe as a closing statement, you could touch on those issues. Since you were the last to speak for our initial round, Mark, we'll begin with you.
Well, Norm, black swans. I mean, I think, one obvious black swan, Iran develops threshold nuclear weapons capability. It's very close to that, and then goes to the bomb, because I think Khamenei will not depart from the earth until he sees a successful nuclear test. A second black swan is Israel will not let that happen, so there'll be Israeli military strikes, and we'll be in a serious confrontation and potential conflagration in the Middle East. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Radik.
I think a US-China conflict over Taiwan would mean that China would become desperate for allies, for anti-Western allies, and that might raise Iran's value to the Chinese leadership.
Fascinating. Alex, you began our conversation. Why don't you end it?
Well, thank you. No, look, I want to go back to what I've repeatedly referred to during our discussion, wonderful discussion, which is, for the life of me, I don't understand why Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, who basically has been running the show since 1989 and has an opportunity to listen to his own people, because it's not difficult to hear what the people of Iran want. They want overwhelmingly, they want change across the board, domestic politics, and in terms of what Iran's doing in the region, foreign policy. I understand he's not going to be able to meet them, because that would, basically, that would be his legacy. And he's a stubborn fellow. If you look at his personality, Khamenei is not going to accept that he's been wrong. That would be the last thing he could do. But at least he could create the conditions for an expression of opinions within the regime in terms of the best way forward the day Khamenei dies. He could at least give him that. He would at least give him that for the sake of the country. And he's not even doing that. Instead, what we're seeing right now is the far right in Iran, which are risk takers. And they have made many bad bets in the last 4 decades. And every time they've cost Iran dearly. And we see right now what's going on just this week with the video coming out of Gulf of Oman with, the bravado, the unnecessary bluster. For what? For what purpose? To prove what point? That militarily you can defeat the United States? Who takes that seriously? I mean, if he could just man up as an old man that he is, as someone who's been there almost as long as the Shah of Iran was the Shah, by the way. Soon enough, he's been there almost as long. What is his legacy? To bring Iran to the brink of a conflict that would devastate not just Iran, but good part of the Middle East. That I hope that's not where he wants to take the country. But am I optimistic that Khamenei is going to take my advice? I'm not optimistic on that either.
No, thank you all very much. This has been exceptionally insightful. And I can tell our viewers that I've known you all for many years. Your knowledge is deep. Your counsel is routinely sought, and correctly so, by others. And I thank everyone for attending today. Goodbye.
Thank you.